Part 2 deals with the relationships of entities. The first thing we need to look at is the way that we can show the relationships between two entities. And we refer to that in two different phases. The first is called connectivity. And the second is called cardinality. Now, when we talk about connectivity, what we're actually talking about are the relationships between our two entities. Two or more entities, and we'll find a little bit more out about that in part 4 when we get to that. When we talk about cardinality, we're actually talking about two different levels of our entities. We're talking about the minimum accepted number in the relationship and the maximum accepted number in the relationship. Now, participating entities you may hear referred to as participants. And as we look at these relationships, they're referred to as active or passive, referring to active or passive verbs. So what we need to look at is how this notation would actually take place. So let's use for an example a professor. And a class. And we know there is a relationship between the professor and the class, and we'll call that relationship teaches. Now, we need to look at the relationship or the connectivity of these two different entities. So we can set that relationship as one and only one professor can teach one to many classes. That's pretty simple. Now, we want to add in the cardinality. What is the minimum and the maximum of the entities that we're looking at here? And so it's very easy to determine the cardinality on the professor entity because it's one and only one. And we could also say that we could easily determine the entity on the class side by making its cardinality one to many. But when we talk about many classes in this vein, we need to define it a little bit further. So let's use an example of maybe Rose State and say that a professor can teach one as a minimum to 5 classes as a maximum. And so when we look at that, now we have a very good picture of the relationship between an entity professor and an entity class. Now, the question becomes, in your mind, how do we determine this cardinality number, the 1 to 5? And that's done very easily by examining the business rules. So if you think back to chapter 1 and 2 when we talked about how do we gather information about our databases, you remember that one of the things that we looked at were business rules. And they play an important part in helping us determine the connectivity and the cardinality of our entity relations. Now you might be asking yourself as we look at our entities, does an entity always have to exist? And the answer is, well, that depends on the entity. Because we can break our entities down to a couple further descriptions. One is a dependent entity. And you guessed it, the other is an independent entity. Now, when we talk about dependent entities, we can think of them as always being associated with one another. You can't have one without the other. So another way of saying that is if we have one, the other must exist. Just pretend there's a T there. All right, if we look at independent entities, that means they can be apart. And that doesn't tell us a whole lot, so let's say that when we say independent entities can stand apart, maybe it's better to say they can stand alone. So an independent entity can stand alone. We don't need one to have the other. And we can go even further and divide our independent entities by labeling them strong or weak. And the weak we can take a step farther. Now you may also hear a weak relationship referred to as a non-identifying relationship, and the strong relationship referred to as an identifying relationship. And let's take a look at how those are diagrammed, and that might help us understand a little more about a weak relationship. Let's work with a course. and a class. And if we look at the background of our entity, we'll say that a course describes what a class will contain, and so a class is actually an instance of a course, if we want to put it that way. Now, if we want to express the relationship between a class and a course as a weak relationship, we start off with a solid line and then we finish with a dash line. And what makes this a weak relationship is it will say one and only one course has one or many classes. And so if we would add a primary key to course to help us in examining the example, let's say that our primary key is course code, and that our class primary key would be class code. That is code. Now, if you examine this and the relationship that we have, course can stand alone by itself, and because class has its own primary key, it can stand alone by itself. Now, if we want to strengthen the relationship, we would do it in this manner. We'd create our solid line, and our relationship on the course side, one and only one course, can have 0 to many classes. And when we do that, now we have a strong relationship between the two, because we can't have a class unless we have a course, and we can't have a course unless we have a class. Now, what we need to do to kind of clean up the primary key in this case is either generate a composite key for class, that would contain its class's own primary key and the foreign key from course. And at this point, our composite key for class would actually be however we are identifying the classes and the foreign key from course. So a little review as we take a look at this. In the first instance, we could have a class that stands alone. And that's where we indicate a one-to-many relationship. But when we make the change and say that we can have 0 to many classes, then we have a strong relationship between the course and the class, and that's indicated here. So as we look at the relationship, the question you may be wondering is, do we always want to have a strong relationship? And the answer is, well, that depends on your business rules and your clients. You'll have to determine that as you're designing your database.